Exchange, and glad that all of you were to brave it and make it past Just Stop Oil, which of course we choreographed to heighten the drama of this important occasion. Just before commencing proceedings, just want to say that because of the weather, Right Honourable Hazel Blears, one of our panellists, is unable to be here in person, but she will be here on screen, and sends her apologies for not being here in person. Also today, in light of both quantity and quality of our distinguished guests here today, want to extend a particular welcome to Assistant Commissioner of Metropolitan Police, Matt Twist, who will, I'm sure, be contributing to our discussions today. And as you know, we've got an outstanding panel to address this most important of topics of how the rule of law is upheld. Is it being upheld in a way satisfactory to the majority of communities in light of the latest public order developments which precede events in the Middle East, but obviously have become even more sharply into focus since the events of October 7, and really just to see how are particular groups being facilitated more than others or not. How is the law being upheld? And concepts which have been discussed extensively in recent months, such as operational independence, the definition thereof. Has there been a mission creep in that or not? And I know that many, just looking across the audience, will have the strongest of views here, so all our speakers will address this for 5 minutes apiece, rigorously to be upheld, and then we'll throw it open for wider discussion. So if I could just commence by asking Lord Carlile of Berriew KC, distinguished former independent reviewer of terrorism legislation, who's held also senior office in the London Policing Ethics Panel. Lord Carlile, please, always welcome here.
Thank you, Dean. And I could spend about 3 hours talking on this subject without breaking any of the just a minute rules, but I'll try and be 5 minutes. I've spent the best part of a lifetime working with the police, and I have a great admiration, particularly for police officers, and I choose my phrase very carefully. Over those years, and I've worked with the police up and down the United Kingdom, including Northern Ireland, and over a fairly lengthy period as a Member of Parliament and as a barrister in Wales, I've seen wonderful work done, and certainly I used to see ready admission of failures, some of them remarkable admissions by individual police officers who brought to an end cases I was involved in that could have been like the Malkinson case. But I have a concern that the reputation of the police has taken some knocks in recent years. My own view, and this is an overarching issue, is that it is high time for us to reform the structure of the police service, particularly the 43 police forces in England and Wales, territorial police forces in England and Wales, and to restructure them into a much smaller number of police forces with a much stronger strategic approach to complex issues like serious sexual crime, fraud, something I, as a barrister, had a great deal of work in, and of course terrorism and violent extremism. I think that there are some significant failures which have taken place which one can identify very readily. For example, the number of rape prosecutions in London has diminished considerably. The number of officers we were promised that would be dealing with sex and serious sexual offence, rape and serious sexual offences in the Metropolitan Police area has not been fulfilled. It's something like 350 officers short of what was promised. And as a result, the experience of victims is not as good as it used to be. I was responsible for the Prevent Review in 2011, the first Prevent Review. I was actually responsible for a time for the second Prevent Review, but that's another story. And when I was dealing with the first Prevent Review, and I'm grateful to Policy Exchange for providing some background information at that time, I became extremely concerned about how police forces, and this is not targeted at the Met only, it's a general issue, obtained advice and got a good feel for what was going on in the area of violent extremism and terrorism. And I was concerned then and recommended that they should not take advice from organisations which, when paid, use some of that money to fund the support of violent extremism and terrorism. I fear that we're in a similar place today. And so I wanted just very quickly to go through some issues which I think need attention. First of all, the 43 territorial police forces should develop a published set of principles as to where they get such advice. Secondly, no advice should be obtained from those who have a history of supporting extremists other than the operational sphere, where there may, for example, be informants used, which is perfectly legitimate. I would accept from what I've just said, the use of former extremists where it is demonstrable that they've changed their views and are involved in activities designed to extinguish or reduce extremism and terrorism. And I could put my finger, though I think it would be invidious to name them, on some organisations that have done a splendid job, for example in the Prevent area, which are run by people who were active extremists in the past. People with lived experience, as long as they want to put the experience to the public good, can be very important. Fourth, I think that the principles that the police newly adopt should be kept under review through an accountable process, something that we can read. For example, under the supervision of the College of Policing, which has the capacity to obtain evidence on a national basis. Fifthly, I think there should be consultation with the Home Secretary and other ministers as appropriate as to what are the appropriate sources of such advice, so that the government has taken some responsibility with the police for this. It's not enough to say, oh, well, it's operational, because it's quite difficult to define what is operational. And finally, I'm delighted that Jonathan Hall, the excellent independent reviewer of terrorism legislation, is here. I think the independent reviewer, for the time being, and the Commission for Countering Extremism, currently led by Dr. Robin Simcox, should be consulted and kept fully informed on these matters. Now, those activities, those principles would involve some work, but surely it is worth doing the work, for example, of vetting people properly, of doing your due diligence with energy, of sharing information among chief officers, if we produce a system that is more acceptable, more consistent above all, and which has the support of the public, and importantly, cross-party, across-the-board support from politicians who I believe really don't want to make party politics of at least things I've been describing if it can be avoided. So I hope that we can discuss those issues in the course of this morning's event, and I'm very grateful to have been invited to be here.
Thank you. Hazel Blears. Hazel, can you hear me? Well, very welcome.
Yes, I can hear you perfectly.
Thank you. 5 minutes, please, from the distinguished former policing minister and community secretary.
I'll do my very best, and it goes without saying almost that I agree with 100% really of what Lord Carlile's just been talking about, and it's very good to see the event being put on by Policy Exchange, and I'm looking forward to the discussion later on. The Hamas attack and the following protests that have been happening have obviously kind of highlighted some really serious problems in the way that our police service works, but also in the effect on communities. I think anti-Jewish hate crime has gone up 14 times, and anti-Muslim hate crime has gone up 3 times since the Hamas attack in October. It's cost £20 million to patrol and protect communities, and one of my big concerns is that these protests have taken officers away from fundamental community policing. And the price of protest is very, very high indeed. Obviously, we want to protect free speech. I remember going on many demonstrations from CND, Greenham Common, the People's March for Jobs. Those protests were largely good-humoured. The police understood their role, I think, very well. In those days, there were obviously isolated incidents where things went wrong. But there has to be a way to have free speech, proper protests, properly organised, and a police service that's there to ensure that the law is properly applied. And I think in a number of cases that perhaps hasn't happened. One of the things I would say to Lord Carlile's submission here is that I think strategy is important, but I probably, from my own experience, believe that culture kind of beats strategy for breakfast, and therefore embedding a culture within the police service that protest is legitimate, that the response always needs to be proportionate, is probably an area that needs much more work to be done. If we look at the protest against the killing of Sarah Everard, what happened to Patsy Stevenson in those circumstances, it was one of the most horrific things that I've ever seen. And it alerted me to the fact that more needs to be done. The biggest change that took place when I was the police minister was the move to neighbourhood policing. And I do worry that that begins to get frayed because the pressures on the police service are so great. I agree that perhaps we need fewer police services, not fewer police services, but fewer organisations around the place, and people could come together and learn from each other. In terms of differential policing, where actually in Salford, I have to say, in my constituency, which was besieged by serious and organised crime gangs, we had a chief superintendent who did do differential policing. He knew all the people who were involved in the gangs. He would go and knock on their doors. He would look at what they were wearing for the day. He would look them in the eye and say, I'm going to be on your back every minute of every day. And that kind of differential policing actually did help communities because we took on the serious and organised crime gangs and actually made a real difference. But I do worry that the neighbourhood policing has perhaps got a lower kind of priority than it did have, and I would like to see that absolutely raised to the top, because the trust in the police is crucial to their effectiveness, and trust means being dealt with fairly, being effective in controlling and reducing crime, and ordinary people identifying with the values that the police represent, and that gives you much more legitimacy than otherwise. So policing by consent is the only way to protect communities. There have been numerous incidents where that hasn't happened, but interestingly, I think the Israeli police actually established in 2016 a directorate for improving policing services for the Arab public. So there is some movement around there to try and bring people together. They recruited from Arab communities, they recruited women, people from different religious and cultural backgrounds, and provided new police stations. So, you know, it is possible. I hope we don't get to the point where we all just despair of this situation, and we're not able to give practical ways of making the situation better. The police obviously need to have operational independence, political impartiality, and I think the last point I wanted to make really was around the issue of taking advice from various organisations. I think we need to be very, very careful that people actually who have extremist views are not able to influence the policing that takes place in these circumstances. I personally refused to meet with the Muslim Council of Britain when they came to see me, because I had great reservations. I insisted that they brought women with them, with young people, and that they got contemporary views about all of this. So I think it's something we need to really keep under the microscope, monitor it, but above all, make sure that we don't reduce the idea of community policing and confidence in the police, in those communities hardest hit, because we're facing a whole myriad of challenges. That community policing is what will save us and continue to keep communities safe.
Thank you. Lord Hogan-Howe, good to have a former commissioner here.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for the opportunity. I'm going to, first of all, say that I agree entirely with Alec, sometimes for slightly different reasons about the structure of the police, but also agree, as Hazel, support him about how you pick your advice. I think the suggestions he made about how you get good advice are sensible ones, and it's always difficult at times because sometimes political people don't always reveal their full agenda when they are discussing things publicly. So I think it can be quite difficult to know where to get that advice, but I do agree with the fundamental point that you've got to be careful who you listen to. My concentration really is going to be on the fact that obviously you might think that my support is generally for the police, and it broadly would be. That's been my career. However, if I thought they were wrong, I would say so. I'm not going to say something that I think is untrue. I think they do have a difficult problem. The complexity of the Middle East has foxed the best brains in policy, in politicians around the world since 1948 and well before that. We haven't come up with a solution. It's a complex problem. And one of the things I often thought when I was Commissioner was, in a slight perversion of chaos theory, is that when a bullet was fired in different parts of the world, then the ricochets could happen on the streets of London. I don't mean physically, I mean the consequences. In a diverse community, in a difficult city to police at the best of times, and then if the debate takes place on the streets, then it is the least effective place to have it. And what you're always looking for, of course, immediately is to stop any violence or to prevent the likelihood of that violence if it should happen. I start by condemning, of course, the horrible attack, the terrible attack of October the 7th of 1,400 Jews who were murdered by Hamas. That was murder, pure and simple. There was a big debate about, was it terrorism? It's clearly an act of war. And in fact, Israel has said that, and I would agree with it. And then since then, we've seen now 25,000 Palestinians lose their lives in the response to that act of war. So by any stretch of the imagination, there's going to be a debate. And that's the debate that we've seen, sadly, on the streets. We've seen 9 big marches pro-Palestinian, between 30 and 300,000 people. We've seen 3 big marches in support of Israel, between 5 and 50,000 people. These are huge numbers, even in a city of nearly 9 million people. And it produces a real problem. At the time, I think the police were also trying to deal with Just Stop Oil. And I think, as Hazel just said, the only place you can get the officers, I think there's about 1,700 deployed to many of these big events, is from the streets. There isn't a separate box. We don't have the CRS as they do in France. They have to be taken from the body of the policing service. So it's vital that we make sure that we keep things as calm as possible. What the police's priority, it seems to me, is first of all to prevent any threat of immediate violence. The law is very clear about that, either threatening it or carrying it out. Glorification of terrorism is illegal. Support for Hamas as a prohibited body is illegal. And anti-Semitism is illegal. And of course, it's quite right to ask the police, well, what are you doing about it when you see it? I think we should also be asking other people questions about it. The Crown Prosecution Service has been involved in taking advice on this. And they have to give advice, particularly in some of the areas where the law is relatively new. Some of the Public Order Act came in last year, and so there is new interpretations, and of course the courts I know of one or two people who've been prosecuted since some anti-Semitic banners have been displayed who were fined £100. I don't know what sort of message that sends, but it's not a strong message. And I think at times of potential public disorder, you need to send strong messages. The police do, CPS do, and so do the courts. I think the Met would accept that initially they were a bit slow to react to some of the events that happened, to see the significance of some of the comments. Some of them were explicit. To be fair to the officers involved, often they're policing Croydon the day before, and then suddenly at the beginning of these things, they've got to take a view on something that is challenging the world. But even so, I think there's still a fair criticism that it needed a quicker response in some of the things that were said. And also I think they're acknowledging some of the gangs who broke off after the protests, who then went around the West End, intimidating people, whether they were in restaurants, theatres or wherever, never acceptable, and it's got to be challenged. Not easy in a city of this size, but it has to be challenged. I think finally I'd just like to talk about police accountability, because I think it's a really big area. The police have always been accountable through the courts, both the criminal courts and the civil courts. The civil courts can intervene if the police are not using their powers or if they're using them too much. And Hazel talked about proportionality. Quite often the police, as she actually gave examples of, are criticised for doing too much. On this occasion, criticised for doing too little. Now, getting that line can be difficult, and it can actually change through the course of a debate. And we've seen that debate alter over the last few weeks. But they are held to account by people like the IPCC, Parliament, of course, the Home Secretary, of course. I would say myself that in my view, those debates with the Home Secretary are best carried out privately. Because if not, some of the disputes that can occur can provoke the very thing they're trying to avoid. And I think the Home Secretary is such a significant role that it's important to be above the fray, not involved in it. And I think how you get that balance right is very difficult. None of us know what private conversations have taken place. We may know a little, but we don't know all of it. But I do think generally that in fact privacy is best in these discussions. My only final thing is that of course you can hold the police to account. First of all, in the ways I've said already, you can, if you like, remove a chief, or you can remove a commissioner. In fact, we've seen 2 mayors do that. We've seen some police crime commissioners do it around the country. None of them have used the system that was produced by Parliament. What they did was they said, we've lost confidence. Well, okay, you can do it that way, but that isn't the system that was created. And all the PCCs, I think, with one exception, who did remove a chief constable at an employment tribunal were found to have done it in the wrong way. So I think you do have to get it right when you've got these serious jobs. And I think particularly at the moment, we need to have mature discussions about this and make sure that, say, we don't instigate the very thing that we're trying to avoid.
Thank you. Dame Priti, you're always welcome here.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dean. And good afternoon, everyone. And it's a real pleasure actually to be amongst friends today, and great learned and experienced friends who have a great deal of professional and operational experience. And I do actually just want to start by actually paying tribute to, frontline police officers who I had a tremendous working relationship with the police when I had the privilege of being Home Secretary. I enjoyed Bernard knows this and robust discussions. Matt knows this as well. Private discussions, very importantly they were private discussions, because quite frankly I had to have some deeply concerning conversations and discussions with commissioners, police chiefs around some of the most appalling crime issues, quite frankly, security threats to our country. And it's important that that relationship between Home Secretary and our police chiefs is one of mutual respect, confidence and trust. Which brings me to a number of themes, some of which have been touched on already. It is fair to say when I was Home Secretary, not only did we do a great deal to back the police, support the police, put more money and resources into the police through the 20,000 police officers, that's all a given. There was a lot of work in terms of structural change around policing, something that I personally felt was required. So by way of example, police and crime commissioners, 10 years on from having police and crime commissioners set up and elected, I brought in 2 reviews, part 1, part 2, they were called the PCC reviews, to actually make sure that our police and crime commissioners in particular were more accountable, their work was much more transparent, not just to me, but to the public, to the very people that vote for them, put them there and pay for them through council tax and through policing precepts, etc., etc. Now, that sounds a bit bureaucratic, but actually it had a very important purpose. And that purpose was, yes, to demonstrate that they are the people that hold each force accountable, the chief constable in each 43 police force accountable, but also they were driving a crime plan, a vision, a strategy in terms of reducing crime, fundamentally of great importance. And linked to that, of course, they were working with the government of the day. And I don't mean that in a political way that crosses operational independence, which has been touched on already. That's in the way in which, yes, we resource policing, support policing, pick up on issues. And believe you me, you see Roger Hurst here, my own Police, Crime and Fire Commissioner from Essex, doing outstanding work here. Matt will know this too. Others involved in policing will know that day in, day out, Bernard has touched on this, when there's big stuff going on, it's actually the officer from Bexley that is called in, for the big job in central London. And this is how it works day in, day out. And I think, Roger, if I may, I'm going to give the example. I think it was Easter, April 2022, when the same people that are downstairs, the Just Stop Oil crowd, came to Essex and came to, quite frankly, our distribution centres in Essex, oil distribution centres, our terminals, and caused absolute carnage. Not only did they cause carnage, when I went to visit the guys on the ground, we had police officers from Scotland, police officers from Wales, God knows what they thought of Essex at that particular moment. But actually that policing operation cost over £4 million, and that's Essex Police Force having to pay for that and being out of pocket. So these are the types of issues that inevitably end up coming back to the Home Secretary of the day, and these are the types of issues that we have to work through, along with, quite frankly, some of the most really difficult security challenges. We had a bunch of tunnellers, Roger, people that were trying to dig underground of the distribution centre, which could actually cause all sorts of wider issues. So there are all sorts of conundrums there. My next point very much relates to structures, but the College of Policing. I think Lord Carlile touched on the College of Policing. I take the view, and this is all based on my own experience, we made great changes to the College of Policing. That links to the 20,000 police officers. Clearly, we have to have better training, better support. I'm a great believer, a bit old-fashioned, in investing in people. We have to constantly train our police officers, not just new recruits. We have to invest in them. They're going to be the police chiefs of the future, so it's right that we do this. But at the same time, they're constantly learning, and not just law, but key specialisms. And I'm going to come on to differential policing in a minute. But with that, of course, the whole principle of consistency really matters. You can't have 43 police forces making it up as they go along. Not that they would do that, and I'm not implying that they were doing that, but doing things differently. College of Policing is there for good reasons. It has great benchmarks, it has great standards. We were always driving standards. I'm a great believer in pushing those standards higher. But actually also giving our officers in particular the opportunity to specialise. Yes, they have to spend their time doing all the core policing elements, getting out there on patrol, but importantly, going on to specialise. Now, this is really important because the nature of crime and the profile of crime is constantly changing. And we know this. Lord Carlile touched on fraud. Fraud is an absolute shocking area, and quite frankly, we have not gripped fraud at all. It is complex, it is evolving. Even as we speak now and even sleep at night, the fraud levels are becoming much more sophisticated. Online, offline, in the dark web, you name it, cryptocurrency, there's all sorts of things going on. Now, none of us can be specialists or experts in that, and neither can our police officers, so there's a call and a need to do much more there. There are a couple of other areas that I would like to touch on. And differential policing, for that I would like to say, if I may, deem specialisms in policing, because we are not investing enough in terms of specialising. So just to give a few examples, Lord Carlile has also touched on sort of the rape review and convictions around sexual violence, violent assaults and attacks. It's a really good example, primarily because when I was Home Secretary, we effectively conducted the rape review with the Ministry of Justice. My views on criminality, victims of crimes being poorly served are on the record and well known. But quite frankly, we needed some specialisms in policing on that. So we brought in ACC Maggie Blythe to, again, raise the bar across 43 police forces to bring standards and consistency around this entire area, working with our police forces to actually getting them to work with the CPS in a much more integrated and joined up way. Why, you're probably all asking, why did it come to that? Well, the reason being, this is not a great news story or breaking news, but quite frankly, in government, you get far too many institutions and organisations doing this. It's their fault, pointing fingers. And I was simply sick to death of that. It was not good enough for the CPS to blame the police. Now, the police are absolutely up to their eyes in all sorts of things. They're working incredibly hard on case and file preparations and getting together evidence and data. Yes, we needed to do much more, such as literally funding more technology to get digital downloads of mobile phones and things of that nature. But once the police had that, we had to work with the CPS. So we brought in a program called Opsatira, and there were certain forces in the country, even in Somerset, there are others now, where they have this specialism and it's rolling out. And you know what? It's making a difference. It's not going to change the weather overnight, but I can tell you, from last year it's improved, this year will be even better, and next year it's going to be even stronger. And this is really important. I believe we have to do much more in that area. A couple of other points, just on the whole area of extremism and violent extremism. I think Bernard has spoken very clearly about this. Hazel has as well. Nor Carlile has too. I do think the bureaucracy of the state, and by that, you know, naturally that is aspects of civil service, the processes, etc., around ministers in particular. It's a system in its own right. We as politicians, I as a former Home Secretary, as Home Secretary at the time, did not have the full access to information, data, organisations that were even being funded by the state. Now, that has to change. I personally believe ministers should have much more ability, not just to decide, but sometimes call out organisations when it comes to funding streams, and even bring something like a ministerial direction in place when it comes to certain organisations. We should have the power just to say no. And when we say no, we shouldn't then have months and months or weeks and weeks of civil service advice, sort of like arguing, you know, actually we believe this, we believe that, they did a bit of work here. Actually no, because they're linked to another extremist organisation, and quite frankly their track record is spurious, and I'm deeply concerned about that. And I do, just on that point as well, feel very strongly that actually we need more information sometimes from our operational partners who have experience of these organisations, and better, not so much data sharing, but collaboration. And they also should be allowed to express a view in a way in which sometimes systems, the bureaucracy of the state, does not allow that to happen. I think just on link to this, Robin Simcox has been mentioned as well. Having appointed him, I think that role is so important. It's incredibly important. And a missed opportunity. I mean, I was in the Home Office during a range of stuff going on, pandemic, and, you know, a lot of work on policing, lots of other works, illegal migration, you know, a lot of legislation taking place, police crime courts and sentencing bill, which clearly upset Just Stop Oil, as I saw this morning. But with this, when we create these posts and positions, it is absolutely vital that I think government collectively, not just the Home Secretary, but the rest of government, should respect these appointments and actually recognise that these are people that are in place to do an advisory role. And actually their advice matters, their insights matters, and that could help much more. Yes, in shaping policy, but actually giving practical insights and examples of where things are not working. You know, putting the mirror up in government sometimes does not happen enough. And I can speak obviously with a little bit of experience. In a department such as the Home Office, which is so enormous, keeping a lot of plates spinning is absolutely crucial in ensuring that they do not crash down. But quite frankly, the mirror doesn't always go up in terms of, you know, getting not just the right kind of advice, but sometimes that third party advice that is so vital. And without that advice coming forward, some of those plates can come crashing down and cause all sorts of repercussions, which then leads to that sort of cycle of doom, you know, the firefighting, the urgent questions in Parliament, etc., etc. The rest writes itself. So I feel, off the back of certainly a lot of the work that I put in when I was Home Secretary, but some of the system changes that have since come in, there's an opportunity. I think we should be positive and proactive and embrace some of these changes, but actually get our systems to work much better, basically. College of Policing, who I think are doing a great job. Next generation of officers that are coming forward. My final point, and I may have used up all my time, Just on London in particular, London's a bit special, isn't it, really? You know, we saw everything that has happened around protests recently. There's no excuse, quite frankly, because it's difficult for policing. It's really, really hard for policing. I think all our panellists have touched on this. But it is inevitable the police will be criticised. And believe you me, I've spent hours and hours in meetings with the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, the former Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, who obviously was fired while I was Home Secretary by Sadiq Khan, and there was a review and investigation into that afterwards. But, you know, sometimes our police feel that they're damned if they do and they're damned if they don't. I do feel it is important. You know, I say this when I was Home Secretary, I said as a former Home Secretary as well. You know, sticking your neck out there to back the police is quite important in challenging times. Giving the mayor cover while having those private conversations that have been touched on, really important. But the crucial thing is learning lessons when things go wrong. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll just hand it over to the audience now. Usual house rules, no question too outrageous. You just have to state your name and organisation first, also because of the lights I can't see who you all are. However, I do see that Assistant Commissioner Matt Twist, who's responsible for public order, has caught my eye, so I can just about see as far as him.
Dean, thank you, and thank you for inviting me here today. It's really good to be here. I think a couple of things struck me in that, and maybe I can also give some facts and figures which we can bounce off. The investment in people point is so important, isn't it? At a time when things are more complex, issues are more contested and polarised, stuff is more digital and instant, and at a time where each investigation takes longer and is more complicated, and indeed, as last speakers just mentioned, police are more criticised. It's absolutely right that this is a hugely challenging issue at the moment of policing public order in London, with the acute challenges of dealing with very, very large demonstrations on a weekend, and the chronic challenges of dealing with daily protests, activism and demonstrations every single day. Lord Hogan-Howe gave some statistics: 9 national events, huge numbers, 9 pro-Palestinian national events, 3 pro-Israeli, countless local events though, all of which are being policed in our London boroughs and across the communities. In parallel, we've had Just Stop Oil. So between the two of them, 30,000 officer shifts on the policing the main protests, 6,800 mutual aid shifts coming into London to support us from outside of London, cost of about £26.5 million to date, and about 4,600 rest days cancelled. And that's sort of talking back to the investment in people. But that's just the main issue. The Just Stop Oil campaign, the last campaign, took about 10,000 officer shifts, 657 arrests. I think Lord Hogan-Howe mentioned, it's right, absolutely, that the policing response has evolved because the context changes. We police to the law, we police to the line of the law, but the context is really important as well. And it's fair to say that our response has become sharper and more decisive as the events have progressed. We've made 327 arrests linked to protest where people have committed offences. So far, 43 people have been charged. We've still got a large number on bail. And the impact on our counter-terrorism response isn't to be underestimated, as Dame Priti mentioned. We've got 2,700 public referrals into our counter-terrorism extremism line, a 700% increase, 30 ongoing investigations. So what the future brings is something we're all alert to. We need to be careful around this. And the final point is the sort of impact on communities. It's absolutely right that both in terms of the impact of the horrific acts on the 7th of October on the Jewish community resonates so loudly on the streets of London, and it's so important that we're alert to that, which is why we're making so much effort and putting so much time into engaging with local communities. Over 16,000 visits to synagogues, mosques and schools, as well as the strategic partnerships we have with some of the sort of senior members of those communities right across the capital. And I think I'll pause there rather than say thank you, and I'm happy to help with any other specific questions that colleagues may have on the policing of London.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I notice back, I think I see Lord Walney has caught my eye, independent advisor on political violence and extremism at the back there.
Well, thank you, Dean. I feel highly vulnerable now as I came in late, halfway through Priti, so I don't know what what the former speakers said. So, just to say, I think Priti was raising hugely important questions of resources, and one of the things which is particularly concerning me, looking across the piece at protests for the review that I've now put into the Home Office and will hopefully be published soon, is just the level of unintended differentiation just due to the complexity of these issues, and often that lack of specialist knowledge. If you happen to get a police officer who is not an expert in it, and many of these protests are targeting similar groups but in different areas of the country, so the use of the College of Policing and others to be able to harmonise the advice and the knowledge is so important. And what more that the panel thinks we can do to be able to make that effective would be really interesting. And then you know, I guess Burden in particular, I'm interested in your views on one of the I think that this has been stated in the past as too crudely, in the sense of police picking favourites. I think that's very rarely the case. But one of the things that has concerned me is the differential way in which protests that are threatening violence compared to those that are more peaceful can be differentiated, where the police have to go into a crowd control element, and actually they can be concerned that if they jump in and start arresting people, then the situation may get out of control. My view still, there's been some pushback from the police when I've put that to them at different times, but my fear is still that actually you end up with peaceful protests being then treated more harshly in terms of arrests than those where there's that element of the police being needing to stop the thing spilling out of control and creating a riot.
Thank you. Just one more question, just so we take it as I'm just trying to for now. And somebody further down on the left there. Somebody, yes, just there. Thank you. Name and organisation.
Thank you. It's Henry Riley from LBC. We had the Commissioner, Sir Mark Rowley, on last week on LBC talking about policing football matches during Call the Commissioner, which I'm sure Lord Hogan-Howe remembers well, being opposite Nick Ferrari. He said that it cost the Met £18.5 million last year to police football matches in London. We're obviously in the January transfer window for football fans, and they're spending millions of pounds on players every day. I wonder what the panel thought in terms of football clubs paying their way a bit more.
Dame Priti.
Well, I think Matt knows my views on this already, particularly on, well, the football club issue. I've always been one to say I think the clubs do need to stump up more and absolutely contribute to the policing funding, because quite frankly it's not just, I mean, everyone just assumes it's standard on a match day, you know, here's your policing package, etc., and there's an element of that. But as we know, I remember the Euro finals a few years ago, these events can get out of hand and there can be all sorts of other activities, criminality taking place. And then it becomes, as always, I've said this for far too long, you know, the police just get dumped on effectively. They're there to pick up all the pieces. So I would like to see a more proportional engagement, proportionate engagement and better funding basically in this whole area. I think on some of the broader points that have been mentioned, if I may, I remember the activities in 2021. Jonathan will remember this as well, actually. We may have discussed them with the car rallies that took place that were deliberately targeting North London and the Jewish community. So down the Finchley Road, Baker Street area, and it was horrendous. It was really oppressive, nasty, sinister, hostile, threatening, you name it, to the Jewish community. And that was challenging for many, many reasons, because as we know, these protests, and we had car rallies coming down, and we were all trying to literally find out, and I was speaking to across the policing network with the Commissioner at the time and with colleagues in the Met, where did these rallies originate from? Where did these cars start from? So classic example is you then start talking to the 43 police forces, everyone else around the country, start gathering intelligence, etc. But then you see things popping up on social media. There's another rally taking place, in 2 days' time, etc. Inevitable questions, can we stop where the source of the rallies is cars from coming down? And what we found actually was a great deal of inconsistency. Inconsistency in terms of intelligence, information sharing, what other forces were prepared to do. And I do recall having conversations actually with both police and crime commissioners and some police chiefs in different parts of the country saying, I really do think it's right and proper that you just don't allow these cars to leave. What more can you do? And of course some left, some didn't leave, and the Metropolitan Police then had to pick up the pieces. Alongside that though, there were other protests taking place. I saw them with my own eyes. I was walking through parts of Baker Street towards Marylebone where people were gathering with placards. And of course, they're all on social media. And the Metropolitan Police at the time were challenging me, I think it's fair to say, privately, these are peaceful, and if we become too interventionist, they could get really out of hand. This is a challenge, but one of the things I would say, I think policing has to constantly learn the lessons from incidents like this, but also work with the community on trust building, confidence. I think Matt, quite frankly, the Met did a great job during that period. I remember going out with colleagues, a lot of colleagues actually, working with the CST and others. We did much more on places for worship. All these types of things really matter. But that's our response after it's happened. And I think it's really what more can we do to stop this from happening, which finally brings me on to the 7th of October. And I absolutely agree with what Bernard has said. We are now in this very challenging situation and scenario where it's now weekly. It's a huge, huge effort from a policing perspective to man these protests, demonstrations, expressions of, whatever you want to call it effectively, acts of hostility on the streets. But there's that fine balance now. We've got to make sure that those that do terrible things, break the law, are absolutely picked up and dealt with through our legal structure, through law enforcement. And we need more of that, because currently the general view is that there's a blind eye taking place on that. And I think, again, that does have an impact on public confidence.
Lord Carlile.
Well, some very important points have been raised. On the football question, I come from Burnley. I'm a lifelong Burnley supporter. There isn't that much trouble at Burnley football ground apart from on the field. But I would say that most of the trouble that occurs at football grounds is not caused by the football clubs, other than being there. I think there's a case for having a contract between football clubs and the police in which certain items are part of the ordinary police budget. A public order policing of an ordinary kind, but where there are special issues that need to be policed at extra cost, there's no reason why the football clubs should not be asked to pay a reasonable amount for it, and I think that's a sensible way of dealing with it. But back to wider issues, and I wanted to pick up what Lord Waldie was saying. There is a concern, and it is a genuine concern, that there is some differential policing going on, that some communities are being singled out in one way and other communities in a less condign way. And I don't think those communities are asked enough themselves to say what is going wrong. Ask the communities, you will know what's going wrong, and we need to see more of that done. But there is another issue which concerns me as a lawyer and as somebody who knows the judiciary well and spent 28 years as a part-time judge, which is the system is not joined up. Let me give you the example of what happened to people who were speeding on autoroutes in France some years ago. They put courts in a field to deal with the cases immediately. Cases that come to the courts, particularly the Crown Court, arising from demonstrations in London, turn up months, if not years at the moment, later. The whole issue is stale. People are given the opportunity, which they take quite sensibly in some of those cases, to represent themselves. And it becomes an emotional occasion based on a bit of history, which to the jury may not matter anymore. And this is partly because the CPS take a long time to decide whether a charge should be brought, and partly faults in the system of getting cases to court. And I think there's a lot to be said for asking the Chief Magistrate and the district judges and magistrates in London to deal with some of these cases in real time so that they can be dealt with when the trouble that has been caused to the public is actually still fresh in the mind, and the court is considering real issues in that real time. I think that would be a single step that would make a great difference to the way in which demonstration policing is perceived and its consequences.
Really enjoyed everybody's comments, and in particular Priti, your passion about policing. Just a couple of things. In terms of the officers who are called upon to police the demonstrations, I'm just very concerned about their training, their support, and I mean, obviously Bernard will have a view on this. I've always wondered, are they well enough supported by the senior officers? Because community policing, it's easy to say, it's actually really complex and difficult to implement, and you need some of the most intelligent, skilled, sensitive officers leading this community policing. It's not just a matter of bodies on the street, it's people who can have a dialogue with the public, which isn't always easy. And it's not something, as Priti was saying, you know, people have a specialism in communicating, and in being able to speak with the public, getting their message across. So I think there's probably a big gap in community policing, which says that, yeah, we need to have the bodies on the street, we need to have a physical presence, we need to be seen to be doing the work, but actually it's deeper than that. It's whether or not people really understand that what they're doing is making relationships with the public, and that is not an easy task to do. And I do worry that community policing has kind of fallen down the hierarchy of priorities, because there are these other things going on. And, you know, after 7/7, I think I visited virtually every Muslim community across the country. Tony Blair said to me, you need to go out, Hazel, because we really don't know what's happening in many of these communities, and we didn't. And you know, women and mothers didn't know what their children were looking at online. They had no way of accessing any digital content. You know, there are some big hurdles for us, and I think that where we've got to with policing the protests is that it's much more about a physical presence rather than an intellectual presence, a dialogue, a conversation, and that links back to the absolute importance of bolstering our neighbourhood and community policing. And I am genuinely worried that all the resource that's being put into just, if you like, maintaining a safe environment actually isn't being spent on building those relationships which take the long term to get that sense of community and being really, really strong, so that the decent people in the community can actually tackle some of the bad people who are causing us these really, really deep problems. So I'd like some reassurance that investment in community policing is going to continue, it's going to be deep, it's going to be long term, and it's going to empower the police officers that we have to do their jobs in a proper way.
Last comment on this.
Yeah, I think, first of all, Henry's question about football, it's not directly on this debate, but the easiest way to resolve it is to make the clubs pay for the policing which is not at the grounds. The law is very clear. It said that the clubs should pay for what's at. There's hardly any police in the grounds, so they're paying nothing. I would target the Premiership. Charlton, Leyton Orient and a few others are probably going to be put out of business if we put too much of the public cost on policing. But the Premiership paying £100 million for a player, they have the money available, but it's the rest of us who are picking up the bill. So I would target the Premiership, and I would just change the rules so that they had to pay for what's not at the ground, whether it be at Arsenal, at a hybrid tube station, all the other things we know have to be policed. It's vital that these things happen. The second point, Lord Walney's point about, you know, when you intervene and how you intervene, it's a constant dilemma, and sometimes it does go wrong. You've got 2 or 3 options. You either, the officers on the ground immediately intervene, you get a team to do it on your behalf if you think it's going to be more than one officer can cope with, or you do it after the event. And there's quite a lot of digital evidence now, because if you leave it until after the event, the behaviour is unchallenged, and therefore everybody thinks it's okay. So it's a real dilemma. So as much as you can, you should do it during the event. I think there has to be a dose of realism. If you just think about the numbers I mentioned, with 300,000 in a crowd and 1,700 police, which is bigger than most police forces in this country, 1,700 cops, you can work out the ratios. And of course, they're not all in one place. They'll be spread along the route. They'll be, preventing attacks on Parliament and other targets. And they'll not all be available all the time. So there's a limit to what you can realistically achieve with a large crowd. And you do have to make a judgment for the officers' safety as well as the crowds, because if you've got a politicised audience, quite often they will react more strongly than a crowd which is not. So it's not an easy decision, but I think the numbers can dictate it. But equally, you need a bit of firmness, you need some leadership. So we are going to do something about this where we can. But you don't want to cause a worse reaction than the problem you're trying to resolve. So I agree, there are various options, but I think we just have to keep in mind the numbers. Thirdly, just on Alec's point, after the 2011 riots, we saw the court sitting 24 hours.
Right.
It sent a signal.
Very important.
I've never seen them sit on a weekend since.
Yeah.
And yet we've got 18-month delays in the court system. That's not acceptable. Delayed justice is denied justice.
Right.
Witnesses forget, they walk away from the system. We talked about sexual offences. That's just one example. So I think the court system's got to be looked at. In the succeeding 18 months after the 2011 riots, we arrested 5,600 people. It took 800 officers to look at 250,000 hours of CCTV footage. 70% of them were charged, 90% pleaded guilty. The system can work when we get our act together.
And the judges want it to work.
Yeah.
They don't like trying cases long afterwards.
No. The problem is the judges don't want to sit on weekends. They don't want to sit in the evenings. So I'm not being hypercritical of the judges, but the system doesn't work as a system, I'm afraid. So you keep pumping stuff in at the bottom. If it doesn't get taken out at the top, it stops. I'm afraid that's where we are at the moment. Partly COVID, but I'm afraid not entirely. And then just finally, just on this point of community policing, which I entirely agree with, there are some antagonistic points in terms of what we've all discussed. To go for more specialisms, which of course is necessary around economic crime, sexual offence investigation, we could go more cyber, etc. They're coming from one area which is called response and community policing. The 5 to 6 million calls London receives through the 999 system have got to be answered. That's where the volume of officers are in response. But the only way that you keep them in response is not to put them into specialisms. And for the 300 that might be short, I'm not trying to defend what the Commission's decided about. They've got difficult decisions on this. But if they've got to find 300 for sexual offence investigations, they will come from response. There is no other big block. Because you're not going to take them from fraud, you're not going to take them. You can list what you're not going to take them from, but the block that always gets attacked, I'm afraid, are the response and community officers. And my very final point is just on Hazel's point, which is about, I agree with her, which is if you don't prioritise community policing, it becomes the first reserve every time. You can put things in place like abstraction limits, and certainly I've found that's good, where you say they're not going to be removed until they are the third tier that we come to. You can set limits about how often they're away from their neighbourhood. And I think it is important, for the reasons Hazel said, to keep an eye on that, because otherwise they do get dragged away. And they're regarded as least important when, as she said, I think they are the most.
Thank you. Just got a couple of questions now. I see Lord Folkes trying to catch my eye there. Ben Ellery, crime editor of the Times. Lord Folkes. For
I'm not sure I won't wait for a microphone. The visitors at Heathrow are welcomed, or have been recently, in recent weeks, with an invitation to provide any evidence they might have which would assist the Metropolitan Police in investigating war crimes, i.e. information in relation to Israel and Gaza. I wonder whether the panel thinks that's an appropriate use, either legally or factually, of the Metropolitan Police's resources.
Thank you. Ben Ellery, crime editor of the Times. Can you hear me? Are you still there? We can't hear you. Perhaps we'll go and answer the question now. Bernard, on Lord Folkes' point.
If I understand it correctly, then there are some international obligations which are about the international court and its collection of evidence. If I'm wrong on this, then of course I'd take advice, but I believe that there's a requirement. Now there's a question which might be behind your question, which is should they have been as creative and as advanced in collecting that evidence? Because it leaves an impression, together with some of the other things that we've talked about, sometimes which side are you on? Sad that it has to get to that stage, but I think it may leave an impression that there's interest in seeking evidence from one side, but perhaps not the other, when in fact, of course, Hamas clearly breached international law. So where's the evidence being collected for them? It may be they're able to say that they're trying to collect both, which would be helpful. But I think that's the understanding. It's the International Court of Justice which requires, and we're obviously a member and we subscribe, that where there's evidence available, then it should be collected, wherever it's obtained. I mean, in fact, we've seen this, obviously in Ukraine. We've seen it coming through from the past in Serbia or various other international conflict. We have a requirement to collect evidence for good reason.
Priti.
So I agree with much of what Bernard has said, actually. I'm sure Matt will explain the practicalities of it, because the way it's been presented, I think the presentation of it looked really skewed, quite frankly, like one side versus another, which is just wrong and it's unacceptable. Hamas, proscribed organisation, they've committed the most appalling atrocities. We know the context of all of this. We did actually, I was in government at the time when the Russia-Ukraine war broke out, and there was a lot of effort actually with the International Criminal Court to gather evidence from Ukrainian citizens that had come to the United Kingdom. And we spent a lot of time actually in government working with them. So these were Ukrainians that came at our invitation, through our protections, to actually provide evidence of what they saw back home in terms of atrocities. Now, I'm sure Matt can give examples as to how this will work, but I have to say I thought the presentation of this was very skewed. It seemed quite odd to me. Posters at Heathrow Airport, which I understand is, how this sort of was presented, just didn't, to me, seem right. I think it would have been better, if I may say so, from colleagues at the Met to have perhaps gone out publicly beforehand and said, this is what we are doing. Putting context really matters, but explaining why, why and what information we are trying to gather and how this would have been taken further.
Sorry, Matt Twist, did you want to come in there? Just because let's get you a microphone, sorry. Since you've been called upon, then I'll go to Lord Carlile after.
So thank you. I mean, I'll try and help. I think largely it's as Lord Hogan-Howe said. I mean, the duties the Met is discharging, or in this case, counter-terrorism policing is discharging on behalf of the United Kingdom. So it's not just the Met. This is a national responsibility. Is driven by the Rome Statute, where we, in this case, CT Policing, has a duty to gather information on behalf of the International Criminal Court. We are not investigating the things, we are gathering information on behalf of the ICC, who are investigating matters. So we're acting on their behalf in that narrow duty that we have. I think it's fair to say that this has been highly publicised and people have seen the sort of posters at Heathrow and other things. It's also fair to say that where there have been offences in the UK, where people have been supporting Hamas, we have made arrests, we have been swift, we have been decisive. Even last weekend, when we saw something on social media where someone was posting an image which ostensibly was supporting Hamas, we were able to identify that image on social media live time in a crowd of best part of 65,000 people, identify where those people were and make 4 arrests under the Terrorism Act at that time. So I think I accept the point that Lord makes about the handling of it and maybe publicity of it, but that explains why we're doing it. But it's also important to note that where we have seen people who are supporting terrorism, we are being decisive and fast.
Lord Carlile, I know you have an interest in these matters. Response to Lord Folkes.
In direct answer to Lord Folkes' important question, I think, to use a polite word, that the way in which the police have dealt with these notices has been maladroit. They have caused immense concern and some fear to not just Jewish British people travelling through the airport, but to others too, who take perhaps a more even view of the matters. I think the police should beware of being influenced by special interests on either side of this discussion, and should be, in my view, more objective. I would say to Matt Twist that I do not know of any legal obligation that requires the police to collect evidence of this kind, and I think it's immensely premature. I was one of the most fervent supporters of the War Crimes Bill when it became the War Crimes Act. I believe in having war crimes policing in this country. But it has to be done in a proportionate way in due time. The ICC, the International Criminal Court, is floundering around in this issue because it actually has almost no jurisdiction over anybody they're trying to investigate. The ICJ, which is dealing with dispute between nations, is more relevant, but the ICJ isn't asking the Metropolitan Police to put up notices in Heathrow Airport. I think there has been unfortunate and unintended insensitivity in this area, and I think the question is well made, if I may say so.
Thank you. I see Ben Ellery, you're looking to come in, crime editor of Times. Can you hear me?
Hello, yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me? Sorry about that.
Fire away,
Yeah.
please.
Yeah, grand. I just wondered, you know, we've got this new figure today. I think Matt Twist said that the policing the Palestinian protests is £26.5 million. Will there come a point when a decision has to be made on whether we can continue to fund policing these protests? And do we think that there should be, you know, some kind of call made on that the organisers of the protests to fund some of this themselves?
Hazel.
Oh, sorry, which one's that? Sorry.
Hazel, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Yes, yeah. And I heard the question, which I think is really appropriate to raise. You know, this is 25 million pounds already, and I think it's very hard to find a definitive solution, because we protect the right to protest as one of our fundamental human rights, but when it's every week and it's taking officers off the beat, off the community policing, that I certainly really value, as do many communities, then I think it's a really hard dilemma. I hope we don't get to a position where the police are, withdrawing from making people feel safe when they come together and want to protest. Not just about these issues, but about many issues. It is a fundamental tenet of a free democracy that you are able to demonstrate your agreement or disagreement in this way. But when you start to get into these kind of figures, 25 million, where does it stop? Does it last for 3, 4, 5 years? Then I think we need to have a proper discussion about how far, not just the police resource, but this spills over into lots of other areas. So how can we do this? And the idea that some of the people organising the protest should have to pay, again, I find that very unattractive. Because if you're not well funded, then you're not going to be able to protest, and if you are well funded, then you will be. And again, you've got a real difference between different groups and different issues. So I don't have an answer for this, but the answer really is to try and deal with some of the fundamental issues, so that people are not out every week protesting. Let's see if we can't we take the sting out of some of this by some practical propositions for people to be able to obviously express their views, but not at the expense of everybody else, and the expense of not doing some of the other things, whether it's investigating rape or violence or whatever else. There has to be a balance, and a balance struck.
It's an interesting question. I think, first of all, we need to be clear about the cost. I'm guessing that this number includes opportunity costs.
That one does, yeah.
So opportunity cost means basically officers who aren't doing what they should be doing, response, etc. Real cash will probably be overtime. So it'll be a smaller element of that. Now, given the Met's budget's about 4 billion-ish, it's not yet at that critical level, I don't think. However, being that, of course, when you join these officers away every day, when you've got, was it 4,000 rest days, or?
Yeah, 4,000 rest days.
They're going to have to take the rest sometime. So therefore, eventually, you will see an impact on general policing. So I think that's the bigger challenge. Have you got enough officers working in the right way? I think I'm with Hazel. I think if I was on the opposite side of the argument, I would make it out to be a tax on protest. So therefore, can only rich people protest? Or, you know, what about people who are just starting out as protest? You can just imagine the way it might go. So I think it's difficult, because framing that legislation could be a bit of a nightmare, and I'm not a politician, although I play a part in the political process, but you can imagine it wouldn't be easy. So I think that's quite difficult. I think what you might have to consider before that is two things. I think one is whether the conditions you're already imposing are sufficient. So I mean, you could say to people, right, you can march, but march in Kingston. I can guarantee there'd be a big row because nobody wants to march in Kingston. They only want to march in Westminster. But it could make it easier to deal with. So you could do something different. And if you don't think the conditions will apply, the legislation is very clear that if you think there will be serious disorder, and that means more than minor disorder, as we saw with the legislation going through, you can ban them. Now, that's a big debate. Now, I was Commissioner when we banned twice, well, the Home Secretary banned twice on our request. Once in 2011, once in 2012, when EDL were protesting directly outside mosques. Very clear what they were about. And it wasn't about debate. It wasn't about informed discussion. It was about provoking violence. So quite rightly, for up to 3 months, you can ban protests. But it's something that you have to use carefully. Because I think otherwise the politicians will be blamed for shutting down democratic discussion. Never straightforward. I want to remark that it is some of the other things that are in the locker before you consider stopping policing the things on the grounds of cost.
Dame Priti.
Thank you. There's a lot has been said there actually by Lord Hogan-Howe, which I think we should try and unpack a little bit. So first and foremost, doing legislation in this area is controversial and it's quite problematic. Just to probably remind us all of that this morning. However, there are some powers that policing has, our police forces have. Bernard has touched on that already in terms of, potentially banning protests, etc., motivation, working with groups, etc., etc. But this is about the cost. This is about the fundamental costs that taxpayers are incurring through the policing budget, and the costs are just going up and up and up. Secondly, there are also wider societal, economic, business costs, disruption, all the other associated layers. I'll be very upfront. I did look into this because actually I just disagree with the free riding principle and also the carnage that was being created. And it's not just, well, I mean, to be fair, we saw people supergluing themselves to London Underground trains, and then you get the extreme supergluing to Van Goghs in the National Gallery. Or as we saw in Essex, some serious damage, some serious life-threatening damage at oil refinery terminals as well. Any of those terminals could have gone bang. And I recall hearing from police officers who are policing these demonstrations and trying to get protesters off these oil tankers, please do not smoke. They were using vapes and things of that nature, which obviously could have caused a catastrophe, a major event. So, one of the things that we looked into for the revisionist bill that came forward, which was around protests, and not just protests, but actually joining the system up. We've heard about the system not working. So, for example, courts in particular, trying to sort of nudge them in the right direction, but actually looking at compensation orders. Because quite frankly, people's livelihoods are affected, and businesses face costs, and obviously police forces face costs as well. I had left proposals in the Home Office to explore this further, particularly with the MOJ, because it's not straightforward, and putting legislation in this area would be controversial, it would be difficult, it has to be proportionate. If cases are going through, as Lord Carlile has said, you'd like them to go through in a swift way, not 6 months later. In fact, it's more than 6 months, as we know. It's now with over 18 months later. And people forget that collective memory of the, how difficult it was, the level of police heft that was required. I do think this needs to come together. So I have been quite forward-leaning and quite propositional in this space. I did urge government, when I left government, to keep on fleshing this out, looking at it. It has not happened, but I would absolutely urge government to do more in this space. I'm not saying that there is a perfect solution, but it's not beyond the Home Office and the Ministry of Justice to work together. And actually, I think just give a bit of you know, bit of headroom, quite frankly, to our police forces that are having to spend huge amounts of their policing budget, policing protests, but actually for a lot of people and their livelihoods and businesses, for many of the damages that have been done. My final point on this, when criminal damage occurs, I genuinely believe there's not enough proactive action in enforcing that and going after the right kind of compensation. And again, that's where the system needs to come together.
Lord Carlile.
3 points. First of all, and I would defer to a brilliant former government chief whip in the House of Lords who's in the room, I think the legislative challenge of getting this through Parliament, particularly that paragon for the protection of democracy, the House of Lords, would be very significant. I meant that, by the way, would be very significant. Secondly, actually, it's a non-starter. Who's going to collect the money? How are you going to collect the money? And I can promise you that my learned friends would be willing to try to collect the money for the government, as always, under the cab rank rule that the bar has, but actually it's just throwing good money after bad. Thirdly, and Priti Patel has repeated my earlier point, let's just get the legal system working properly for these cases. And I would just say to Bernard kindly, I happen to be married to a judge. They do work at weekends. It's just not always in court. It's quite a challenging job.
Except that they don't sit.
No, but they could. They could. And we've done it elsewhere. When I was independent review of terrorism legislation, there were no bail hearings in terrorist cases in Northern Ireland. And when I said to them, well, I was going to recommend in a forthcoming report that they should sit at weekends, I was able to change my report to say the Lord Chief Justice of Northern Ireland has kindly agreed with the view I expressed to him that the judges should sit at weekends doing bail applications in terrorism cases, and they've done that ever since.
Good. So final load of questions. I know there's tremendous number of people. I'm going to have to disappoint some people at least here, but I'm just trying to. Gentleman there in the middle there. Yeah. Please.
Roger Hurst, Police, Fire and Crime Commissioner for Essex. So really interesting stuff. Absolutely agree with what's been said about neighbourhood policing and indeed about the criminal justice system, and certainly what Sir Bernard was saying about what Lord Hogan-Howe was saying about the difficulties of policing in the modern age. We're all here because we want policing to get better. And I have heard proposed today that one way of doing that is to consolidate and make it all bigger. And what I would say is you have little evidence, in fact you have no evidence, that that's better. If you look at the issues that we have across the country, most of the worst problems are in the Met. In Essex, we've reduced knife homicide by 70% in the last 5 years. We've policed our demonstrations, 5.6 million now actually, and counting, in terms of the spend on the demonstrations we've had, and we've done it peacefully and with the backing of the public. If we had had a single common denominator, it would have been the Met. They are 25% of all British policing, and we would not have been able to do those things. My contention is go the other way. If you actually look at where we are with the Met, they got to their current scope in 1964. In 1972, Sir Robert Marks wrote his first report about the problems of Met culture. We have had 1 or 2 reports on that Met culture every decade since, and we've done nothing about it. The Met needs to be divided up into its constituent parts, allow those who really have that specialist, technical, expert knowledge, in which I would include Matt as well as so many of your other officers, to focus on the national issues. We in Essex could take 2 or 3 outer London boroughs off you, the Thames Valley could do the same, Hertfordshire, etc., Kent, etc., around the centre. You could actually end up with police forces of the size which work. Look around the world. There is no example of a police force of the size of the Met working well. How do we go about having that debate?
2 further questions down the middle line. Lady in the middle there, and then behind, please. Name and organisation, please.
Claire Fox, Academy of Ideas and House of Lords. I was a bit worried about 2 things that have been suggested. Training always makes me nervous. I assume that the Met had been on a lot of training courses when they put out those definitions of jihad. If you remember, it was like they'd been on some sort of academic course and completely missed the point. When you think that a lot of the training going on, conducted by the College of Policing and to it, centres around EDI, diversity and inclusion, it's actually led to some of the differential policing we've talked about, with one interpretation of hate, or being very trigger happy on hate when it comes to, for example, trans rights and so on, versus when we see it in plain view on the streets of London on an anti-Semitic demonstration. And that's one thing that worries me. The second thing was, I do understand the practical, I don't understand what I do. I understand the practical problem of it's a very big demonstration where we cause real problems if we go in too heavy. But the danger there is, it's a bit like, well, because they've got a lot of people and they're big, they can't be policed. And that is the impression that people are getting. And if you remember that terrible incident where there was a demonstration, or there was the van going around with the pictures of the hostages, and it was they who were policed because it was said that if they drove the van through, it would provoke the other protesters because there was more of them, i.e. the people who were supporting the Palestinian cause. That strikes me as being the kind of policing by bullying. And you then end up in this ridiculous situation whereby you have post-demonstration policing and wanted photos put up on social media that makes it seem as though the police are ineffective, if not cowardly, and that actually when you're walking through London and you see the demo, that there are criminal activities happening, but the police won't act in case it makes things worse. That's not reassuring. And I'm one of the people who in the House of Lords, by the way, would fight tooth and nail against any legislation that made the right to demonstration harder. But I do want, when there are policing of demonstrations to happen, that they're properly policed.
Thank you. One more question. I saw somebody behind you there. Yes. I can't see who did. Name and organisation, please. Last question. I'm sorry. Apologies to anyone else.
Thank you. It's Jennifer Scott from Sky News. To Bernard and to Priti, obviously with the discussions that you've had today and some of the remarks you've made, do you want to see the protest laws toughened up? And do you think that would make an impact on what's been happening in London? And secondly, just as you're here, Priti, I'm just asking if you have any sympathy with your colleague Simon Clarke about wanting to replace Rishi Sunak, and perhaps you'd like to go for it yourself and lead the Tories into the next election.
Differential policing of the Tory party. Very good. So three questions there from Police and Crime Commissioner, from Baroness Fox, and from Sky News. Final summing up answers indeed from Assistant Commissioner wishes to intervene as well. Bernard first.
Just on structure, it's a fair point. The Met's had its challenges over the years. I would just say, I didn't grow up in the Met. I didn't grow up in London. I came to it later. And I grew to appreciate its complexity and its excellence at times. But sometimes it was awful. I get that. I'd have to say it's not a fair comparison between Essex and London. London grew by over the population of Essex over the last 10 years. The east of London has a higher birth rate and more migration than the rest of the country. This city is moving around us, and the policing of it is challenging. There's some structural problems. 2/3 of the recruits still come from outside London, because it's not easy to always recruit, and you can't stop people applying from Hull or Essex, who are good people, and they compete with the people in London. So there are some structural problems, and the only other argument I would ask you to consider, policing in 43 forces spends about 1.7 billion on IT. You spend a bit in Essex, they spend probably about 300 odd million in 43 packets. That can't be right. So I think there are other arguments than just the ones you mentioned. I agree with you, a debate would be a good idea, but I'm more in Alec's camp of having fewer with probably the same IT and trying to get more consistent standards, because I'm afraid at the moment it can be inconsistent. I think on Claire's points, I both agreed with her and disagreed with her. I thought it's a good point about the jihadi point. I think it's clearly one of the acid tests.
You mean that jihad didn't mean jihad?
Well,
that's the one you're thinking about.
Yeah, I think the first point is that
from the Met.
Yeah, I think the police
advisors on this.
Well, I think the police might say that because of what you said, diversity training, jihad doesn't just mean supporting terrorism. It means broader than that. But of course, if you're in the middle of a protest against Israel, it might well. It might well be a presumption or our assumption that that's the starting point, not the finishing point. So I think that discussion does have to be had, and I agree with you about that. On the point about the van, I'm going to slightly disagree with you. If you see a van going to go into the middle of a crowd who might start bricking it attacking it or whatever, and you can't stop the crowd attacking if you haven't got enough at the time, you might decide to give them some advice. They might not take that advice, you might not stop them, you might not arrest them, but you'd be foolish not to give them some advice if you thought it was going to cause a real problem. I don't know enough about this incident, but I think that's got to be considered alongside some of the things that you mentioned. And then in terms of the question from Sky News, I'm not going to address the second one, but the first one, if I understand it, I think probably by the application of gradually, the police have said they're learning, CPS are learning, the courts are going to have to get hold of this as well. I'm not sure there are too many gaps at the moment. I would hesitate before I change the law at the moment. I think there's some discussions about war memorials. You remember we saw somebody climbing all over war memorials. Now, as it happened, that was done at night with no one else around. And so therefore, most of the threatening behaviour legislation didn't kick in. If society decides it wants to stop people climbing over war memorials, which I would support, because of the distress it can cause people and the insult it brings, then it's going to have to do that. But at the moment, there's a bit of a gap in that area. So I would hesitate before I went for more legislation. And as I think Alec and John and a few others in the audience will know, trying to get more public protest legislation through Parliament this year, let alone next, I think is going to be very, very difficult. So I would hesitate at the moment and try and make better use. And sorry, just the very final thing. Tomorrow a truce could break out, and I hope it does. I hope we end up with the hostages home. We haven't talked about the hostages really. We've talked about the people who died, but there's still 130 people trapped with people who they think, I'm sure, are going to kill them shortly if they haven't already. They've got to be got out. And please God that there's some kind of solution where there is a truce, they're out, and we can see an end to the bloodshed. In which case, presumably the protests will stop. And you've got to always consider, I would say, in terms of legislation, do you react immediately or do you have a reflection some months later? And then consider, what did we learn? Were the gaps, or could we have done more at the time in a different way? But I would hesitate at the moment, and let's see, politicians can do what they can do best, form solutions here in the Middle East, and others internationally might help them.
And quickly on public order, just indeed for all the other panellists as well, I think Professor Eakins, head of Policy Exchange and Judicial Power Project, is here, written a lot about the Ziegler case, and I know that some senior Met officers want to see that addressed so they can handle this before the 7th of October, the Just Stop Oil and other protests. Would you be in favour of having specific legislation to overturn Ziegler?
Yes. For those who aren't aware, Ziegler decided in the Supreme Court that mere obstructing the highway, which is the simplest of offences, you don't need any intent, you just block the pavement or you block the road. But Ziegler decided the police have got to consider, I think it was a London case, but it could have been anywhere, you've got to consider, was there an alternative route? Could we have done more to prevent it in the first? It went through about 5 different conditions. All you've got is a cop on the ground saying, tell you what, just shift. You're blocking the pavement, you're causing people to be delayed, you're causing ambulances to be slow to arrive, but now that court decision, they've accepted that it's left them with a problem, us with a problem. Ziegler says you've got to do a whole complex analysis of what you should do before you arrest this person. I keep it very simple. If you want to put that right, do it in a court. Make the arrest, allow them a defence, and then put it right. But don't put doubts in the mind of the cops about the simplest of things, about blocking roads that we rely on to keep each other safe and rely on to get to hospital.
Hazel, final thoughts.
I was just thinking about all the things that we've talked about today, and I think in my opening I talked about culture, and culture being probably the most important thing, and the question about the dominance of the Met made me think a little bit more about this, because the Met is huge. It's an enormous kind of monolith, very, very difficult to kind of get a hold of. And the culture in the Met has been, a problem for a long, long time. Certainly since I was police minister, and lots of other police ministers since then have found it difficult to deal with because it is so big. It has some benefits in terms of the specialist work that it does, the specialist policing that it's able to do because of its size and because of its budget. But the culture that's persisted and the misogyny. I think I started off talking about the demonstration that there was, and the woman, I'll never forget the pictures of the woman who was held down physically because she was part of the demonstration, and it was horrendous. So I think that, there are arguments that size and dominance can create a very poor culture. And I was just remembering, I think it was the very first week that I became the police minister, and I had a very, very difficult issue to deal with in one of the forces, and I won't name it. They had commissioned a calendar, and they had Miss January and Miss February, and throughout the whole of the calendar, and they were women police officers in the flimsiest of clothing, and I found this absolutely shocking. They printed hundreds of this calendar, and I had to have the chief constable in my first week and say to him, what do you think you're doing? What kind of culture is this? We're talking about community policing. We're talking about being open and honest and straightforward. And what is meant by this? I think he was very, very chastened at the time. But to have something like that, as that you think is okay, you think that kind of behaviour is okay. I would like to think now that forces have changed, quite dramatically. And in my early days, there were no women's uniforms. They had to wear men's uniforms, men's shirts, men's trousers. Absolutely ridiculous. So we have made progress, but I still think that the issues around culture are still a problem for us, and we should never take our eye off the ball in any of the forces, because we have to have a culture that is democratic, that's inclusive, of people from every background, from men, women, trans people. That openness will actually improve the policing that we do, and we lose it at our peril.
Thank you. I think it'd be remiss of me not to conclude my remarks by starting off by actually just thanking Roger Hurst, not just for his question, but actually for the work that he's been leading in Essex, because we've seen some incredible changes in policing in Essex. It wasn't all rosy, believe you me. And I think, Roger and Essex are a good example of how many of the changes we've brought in, reforms to PCCs, all of this actually is delivering for the public. And the reason why I say this is because, it's in policing, and in this particular area of debate, it's too easy to hear about the negatives constantly. It's right that we do, because we've got to learn and we've got to sort them out. But we must also learn from others, and I think this is really quite important. So to Hazel's point, the example Hazel has given is shocking. That's the first time I've heard that. While at the same time, though, we've got to make sure that there's strong enough leadership, we're doing the right thing morally, but actually making sure that we are representing the British people when it comes to serving and policing. And with that, if I may come on the wider point about the Met, in Essex we lose a lot of officers to the Met, we know this, and Roger and I spend a lot of time talking about this and discussing this as well. However, it's painful. I think it's really painful, and I think it's painful for the Met as a whole. And by the Met, I'm not speaking about just the institution, organisation. It's for the officers that serve in the Met. There is nothing more demoralising for them to hear day in, day out. The newspaper reports, the accusations. We went through it all. Matt will recall this as well. The appalling murder of Sarah Everard was just horrendous. I mean, there were many, many really difficult conversations that I was involved in. There were many HMI reports. We've got through this round table and not even mentioned HMI, the role that HMI plays. Just some shocking revelations. Daniel Morgan report, you name it, just on basic housekeeping, the way forensics were handled, all sorts of things came out. Now, we can't just have report after report and do nothing with it. That's where leadership comes in, and obviously Mark Rowley is the commissioner of the Met. I hired him, and with that we brought in a range of changes, new leadership changes, all sorts of things. But it takes time. It does take time. The revolution isn't going to come overnight. And there are big steps that are being taken, and I actually feel quite passionately about the team that are leading the Met. I think they're good people. However, the one thing I would say, this is a quasi-political view. Some of you think, well, she's going to say that anyway. When you look at fundamentally what happened to the previous commissioner, the rows that took place then, there was a view that there was some degree of political interference, and one could argue that actually undermines some of the structures within the Met, not so much conduct but decision making, and that has repercussions, both immediately and further down the line as well. And with that, I do think that from a Met perspective, and we saw this with the restructuring, reorganisation that took place in borough commands, again, that takes time to bed down, and I do think that has caused problems. Match will know this. We've had many discussions with the previous commissioner and the new commissioner when he came in, and that's part of the reason why I think policing in London has been so challenged. The lack of getting crime down, the whole issue about knife crime. There's a lot of great work, huge investment going in, but actually when it's just negative story after negative story, another death, then it becomes really, really hard and difficult.
Can I just ask you one thing just on Baron's Fox's
Yes, I was going to come on to that, absolutely.
On the differential.
So College of Policing is not all bad, if I may say so, and I think it's important that we recognise that. And it's not all about diversity training. Let me just get that on the record. The importance of the College of Policing is absolutely about raising the bar and standards, specialisms, all those crucial things we have discussed. But Baroness Fox, your point is well made. It's really well made, actually, and it's well heard that, we can't keep on, and it's not just in policing, but quite frankly, it's across many other public sector institutions. We cannot keep going down this route of training being, a sort of de facto default position for the areas that you spoke about. That concerns us all, quite frankly. In public life it should. Training, institutions, College of Policing, the same for the work that we were trying to do on fire reform as well. We're trying to bring policing and fire colleges together and actually professionalise fire in a way in which it hasn't been professionalised. It's really vital, mainly because of the protective security work that takes place, the specialisms, but also public safety, really, really important.
And Ziegler, final thing.
Yeah, I agree completely.
Yeah.
I mean, this is literally where, this has just become a layer cake. Too many interpretations that become subjective. Quite frankly, this was about obstruction. Obstruction is obstruction, and, it just causes all the problems that we've spoken about when it comes to protests, the cost of protests, and all the other associated costs.
Brilliant, thank you. Lord Carlile, last word.
First of all, on Ziegler, very occasionally the Supreme Court and formerly the House of Lords Legal Committee has produced a judgment which is an aberration. Ziegler is, I'm afraid, an aberration, but I wouldn't get too distressed about it because mostly, in most other cases, Ziegler could be distinguished on the facts anyway. But it is an example of the woeful shortage in the Supreme Court of judges with real experience of criminal practice and giving judgments in criminal cases. The public interest in the criminal law and public law is greater than in any other segment of the law, yes. But for some reason that's underrepresented in the membership of the Supreme Court. Final point I wanted to make, and I hesitate to be seen to be disagreeing with a very effective and distinguished Police and Crime Commissioner, Mr. Hurst, but I believe that there is both positive and negative evidence in favour of reducing the number of police forces. First of all, a lot of police forces around the country have struggled to find a new chief constable, and they've certainly been very short of applicants to be chiefs of police in those areas, which shows that even in the senior police service there isn't a huge appetite for commanding inadequately funded police forces. Secondly, there are examples, and I would pick out the counter-terrorism units, which are about 11 or 12 in number now, which have been supremely effective in protecting the public and detecting terrorist crime. And I've been very close to this over many years. And I would say that they provide a model for specialist groups in police forces or for larger police forces where there is a far greater level of competency in difficult subjects. And the same applies, for example, to fraud. Thirdly, I think having a smaller number of police forces, better commanded and better run, is not the enemy of localism. I would like to see every large area know, for the public to know, who their senior police officer is. When I was a boy in Burnley, we always knew who the Chief Constable of Burnley was. I can even remember the name of one of them, Mr. Noble, from when I was a boy. And he was looked up to in the town. He walked the streets of the town sometimes. And I think this can be done more successfully in larger forces which are able to distribute their police officers in a more logical way.
And just finally, just on the point that Baroness Fox was talking about tying in with your own opening remarks on staff associations.
Well, I have a concern about staff associations in the police. I think this is a well-publicised issue. I do not believe that there should be staff associations that in any way stray outside a fundamental interest in the efficiency and effectiveness of the police service. And I think the police would be perfectly entitled to scrutinise the many professional organisations to ensure that that is the case. It might not reduce the number of interest groups, but it should increase the effectiveness of what they do. I think women, Muslims, gay men, trans people, whatever group you wish to name, should be represented constructively as units in the police, just as they are in every other profession, but it has to be consistent with the purposes of the police organisation they're in.
Brilliant, thank you, and thank you to all of our wonderful panellists. Thank you also to David Spencer, our outstanding head of crime and justice, for his part in organising this event. Really just we'll be revisiting these matters in the very near future, but just want to say thank you to the audience, thank you to our panellists. Join me in expressing.